Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed for another Q&A session. Really enjoy doing these. It's been a couple of months since the last one. And of course, I really appreciate everyone that has submitted questions to us either via the YouTube community tab or our Discord community, which is accessible to Patreon and Floatplane members. So without further ado, let's get into the questions. Given a 240Hz screen, does it make any sense to run this screen at 240Hz if the FPS in games never exceed 120? Consequently, would running the screen at 120Hz not be the better alternative? Yeah, so typically, if you've got an LCD panel at least, running that monitor at a higher refresh rate will give you better performance. So better response time performance, better overshoot behavior, and you'll also see some scan out benefits as well, depending on the screen, of course. So if you're running at 240Hz, typically the scan out from the top to the bottom of the display will be quicker than at 120Hz, and you just get the second frame duplicated with no real difference with the scan out there. So yeah, that's kind of the main benefits to running at 240Hz, but these benefits will only really apply if you're running at a fixed refresh rate, because obviously to get the frames perfectly duplicated, to not see any stutter and judder and things like that, then you will need your 120 FPS to be perfectly duplicated to 240Hz. So if that's the case, if you're running at a fixed frame rate like 120 on your 240Hz monitor, then I would typically recommend running it at 240Hz instead of 120Hz, simply because the performance will be that little bit better. And there's really no downsides, typically speaking, from that second frame being duplicated. There's no real difference between the frames. So yeah, you're just really benefiting from the performance benefit at 240Hz. The downsides here, though, are things like, if you're not quite at 120 FPS, then you'll pretty much just be sacrificing variable refresh rate functionality to run at that higher refresh rate. So if you're never exceeding 120 actually means like you're running at 100 FPS, maybe 110 FPS at times, then yeah, if you're trying to duplicate that up to 240Hz, then yeah, you're going to be missing out on things like variable refresh rate. You're going to see a bit of that judder, stuttering that we typically associate with running at a frame rate below your monitor's maximum refresh rate with VSync enabled. Alternatively, with VSync off, you may see tearing and those sorts of things, which is not ideal. So typically, I would recommend people play games with variable refresh rate enabled in this scenario. So yeah, you will be seeing slightly worse performance around that 120Hz range, but you'll be benefiting from the smoothness and the lack of judder and stutter from variable refresh rate technology. So there's always trade-offs there. It would be nice if there was a mode where if you were expecting to run at a lower frame rate, so for example, you have a 240Hz monitor, you're planning on running at, let's say, 80 to 100 FPS, it'd be nice if there was a setting where you could just automatically force the monitor to be duplicated in frame rate at all times. But with things like low frame rate compensation, that's not always how it works. Typically, if you've got, say, a 240Hz monitor, maybe the minimum refresh rate is 48Hz or 60Hz, in which case LFC will only be activated below that sort of refresh rate. But again, it depends on the monitor. There are some monitors that function a little bit differently to that. So yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, as I said, for most people, if you're playing at a fixed 120 FPS on your 240Hz monitor, run it at 240Hz. For most other types of gaming, variable refresh rate is probably the way to go. Any burn-in on your personal monitor? If so, how noticeable is it when gaming or watching content? Would you buy the same monitor again? So, as viewers of the channel may know, I'm currently using the Alienware AW3423DW as my main gaming display, which is separate from my productivity monitors, my workstation, where I've currently got a triple 4K setup going. But for gaming, I use the Alienware QD OLED monitor. And I had an update about 6 months ago on the channel that was talking about the burn-in that I'd experienced on that panel, which is very, very minor. There's sort of a very faint line running down the middle of my screen, probably from side-by-side app usage. It's very difficult to notice. It's not something that I've seen while gaming, as an example. But if I was viewing some types of static gray content, you can sort of just barely see it there. So yeah, not much has changed compared to that previous update in terms of the burn-in on my screen. I'm certainly not starting to see taskbars burnt in or game UI burnt in. I've just recently been playing Starfield as an example for about 80 to 100 hours. and no burn-in of the UI from that game or anything on the screen. So yeah, maybe that would be the case if I was playing the same game for thousands of hours, but so far what I've seen hasn't really been too much burn-in. I have used it as well for some brief periods of web browsing or watching videos, maybe a couple of hours here and there, but that hasn't really triggered any sort of burn-in on the screen at all. So yeah, I've been pretty satisfied with the burn-in of the monitor so far after using it for about 18 months now. I guess my use case is probably less likely to cause burn-in. I am sort of using it in the recommended way where, you know, you don't use it for productivity apps for 8 hours a day, that sort of thing. So if I was doing that, then I think my experience would be very different. But as the sort of intended use case for a QD OLED gaming monitor is gaming, that's what I've been doing. The burn-in so far has been non-existent, negligible, those sort of words I think would be fair to describe it. So yeah, as far as that side of things is concerned, then yeah, been pretty satisfied. Would I buy the monitor again? I think if I was buying more towards the end of the review cycle for some of these products, I've now tested 5 monitors, I think, using the 34-inch QD OLED ultra-wide. Obviously, I started using the Alienware model because it was the first one that came in, but if I was choosing one now, I think I'd probably choose the AW3423DWF model instead. Simply because it's a little bit less annoying with some of the fan behavior. It's got better control over its burn-in features, so the compensation cycles and things like that run more in the schedule that it's supposed to. Not that I'm really seeing burn-in, but maybe that would improve things as I continue to use the monitor over time. Obviously, it has, you know, upgradable firmware and things like that would have been nice. The Odyssey OLED G8 from Samsung also would have been a contender there. I think I probably would have chosen between those two products if I was going at it again, but you know, I'm still quite satisfied with the Alienware model, and I actually have both of those other monitors to choose from as well. So I could switch over to them, but you know, I figure I'll stick with the existing one, see how that goes over a period of time. But yeah, I probably would still stick with the same format. So I really like the 34-inch ultra-wide type of format. I've been testing the Asus 49-inch ultra-wide at the moment as well. And while that's it's a bit more immersive, it is larger, has, it's 144 Hz, so maybe I'd choose a 240 Hz model instead. So yeah, I've been pretty satisfied with the monitor that I've had so far, and I did buy it, so I guess that, maybe adds a little bit to the picture there as well. But yeah, I think I'd probably choose a slightly different model of the same format if I was choosing a different monitor again. The thing we're most looking forward to are the 4K OLED gaming monitors coming out next year. However, it looks like some of them will not have DisplayPort 2.1. Do you see that as a deal breaker, and why? Not really. I don't think this will make too much of an impact on any sort of recommendation for those monitors. DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC is pretty much going to be sufficient for things like 4K 240 Hz, which we're expecting from those OLED monitors. So whether you use the DisplayPort connector or HDMI 2.1 that could also handle those sorts of things, either way shouldn't be too much of an issue, and obviously those types of connectors will have pretty good compatibility with most GPUs of today. The real concern over DisplayPort 2.1, and why a lot of people keep bringing this up as sort of a factor of, oh, you need this next generation monitor to have DisplayPort 2.1, is whether or not we need to be using DSC, display stream compression, or not using DSC. Some people seem to have a really big issue with DSC for some reason. I've never really seen any visual difference between DSC on or off on some monitors where you can turn it on or off. It's not really something that I expect to have too much impact on day-to-day usage for monitors. Now, it isn't a fully lossless compression technology. It is lossy, but it's supposed to be visually lossy or visually lossless. So you're not supposed to be able to tell any differences outside of very specific test patterns. I've sort of looked across a wide variety of content at times in the past, and as I said, I haven't really noticed too much of a difference with DSC on or off. So from a visual standpoint, I don't think that would be too much of a concern. But DSC does introduce some compatibility issues with GPU features, which I talked about back in a question in February, where someone asked about DSC being advertised or not, and whether that's a big issue. For example, if you're on an NVIDIA GPU, if a monitor has DSC enabled, then you'll be locked out of some things like super resolution technologies and all those sorts of things. So yeah, obviously not using DSC would be the ultimate solution and the way to go. So DP 2.1 would be the preferable option for those monitors, but I don't see it as a deal breaker. And I think it's more on the companies like Nvidia and AMD, if they do have features that are incompatible with DSE, to figure out how to get those features working with DSE. I think that's more on the GPU manufacturers than the monitor manufacturers, which is sort of what I talked about back in February. So yeah, DisplayPort 2.1 for these products, don't really see that as too much of an issue, but I would prefer them to be DP 2.1. I guess it depends, like there could be some monitors that are coming out that have even higher refresh rates and may start having limited features over DisplayPort. I think that's where we start to see the issues of DisplayPort 1.4 and where we would need to see an upgrade to DP 2.1. So for example, if you had a super high resolution, high refresh rate monitor with a high bit depth, and you had to turn down from say 10-bit to 8-bit to run over DisplayPort, or HDR wasn't available, or the highest refresh rate wasn't available because of the limitations of DisplayPort 1.4, then I think that would be a really big consideration, and you'd have to be using DisplayPort 2.1 on that type of product. But if we're getting all the full capabilities of the monitor, but we're just having to use DSE, then as far as I'm concerned, that's not too much of an issue. But I'm sure people maybe have a few different opinions on that one. All right, we've got a longer question here, but I think it's one that's pretty interesting. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on the differences between the video processing capabilities of smart TVs versus monitors. Having a display that can adequately handle compression artifacts from streamed content is something HDTV Test covers extensively in their reviews of TVs. Now, I was wondering if any monitors you know of do that to a similar degree as the aforementioned smart TVs. The OLED panel is pretty much the same, just different sizes and pixel densities, and most content is sadly IMO streamed nowadays, so having a monitor capable of adequately dealing with compression artifacts is quite important to me when considering an upgrade. There's also motion handling for 24 FPS content and all sorts of other bells and whistles that smart TVs come with doing thanks to their processors. Although I wish a dumb monitor would be enough, these features are only growing in importance to me as the content libraries of various streaming platforms continue to grow while physical media sadly continues its decline. So yeah, I guess this is sort of like what's the benefit of having a smart TV processor with your monitor as opposed to just with the TV? And I think there's a couple of ways to look at this. Typically the monitors that use more smart TV processors, so things like the Samsung Odyssey OLED monitors, as well as some of their mini LED products, and LG TVs as well that you can use as a monitor, have more of the smart TV processor side of things. So if you're using one of those, like the OLED G8 for example, you can run content directly off the monitor using smart TV apps. You have a few more controls over some of the color processing capabilities. So for example, if you wanted to run the sRGB mode with full custom color controls, then that's very possible on the products with smart TV functionality. And of course you can have all sorts of other features integrated because they're simply much more powerful. But I think in general, a lot of what a smart TV processor should be doing realistically for a monitor should be done on the source side of things on your PC. So for example, displaying content from Netflix or Amazon Prime Video or YouTube or any streaming service, probably the best way of doing that should be through running it on your PC and then using any GPU side features to handle things like compression artifacts. Now, I typically want to run my content in the way that it was intended to be produced. So running things like, reducing compression artifacts can, I guess, degrade the content at times. It depends on how good the quality of that feature is, but I typically like to turn those features off. So I'm just getting the actual content as it was presented to the monitor. But, if there is a GPU side feature that handles things like compression artifacts, that would be the way to go, because I'm thinking of this more as sort of the upgrade side of things. Like if you're buying a monitor and you're relying on smart TV functionality, things like the compression artifacts and so on, how much upgradability, how much improvement to that feature are you going to be getting over time? It's probably going to be pretty much what is shipped with the monitor when it comes out. Whereas if you're relying more on the GPU side of things to run those features, then potentially you could upgrade your GPU to something that runs those features a bit better, or alternatively, they will just provide you a better feature via a software update or driver update in the future, which is something that we have seen with Nvidia, for example, adding in ways to enhance your upscale videos from 1080p to 4K and do all sorts of other clever things there. So that tends to be what I would sort of be considering, because if I think about a monitor, you're going to have it for a long period of time. You may own one of those high-end monitors for 5 to 10 years, but you may be upgrading your GPU every 3 years, for example, in which case, yeah, the upgradability on the GPU side is going to be happening more often than on the monitor side, so you'll be getting those features upgraded more often. So yeah, to me, that's how I'd be sort of thinking about those sort of features. I'm not saying that it's bad to have them integrated into a monitor, but for me, most of that stuff should be happening on the source side of things. But unfortunately, with the PC landscape, there are some functionality that PCs simply can't do at the moment, one of them being Dolby Vision output. So if you wanted to use, let's say, a streaming app like Apple TV Plus, or again, Amazon Prime Video, Netflix, those sorts of things, and you wanted to access your Dolby Vision content, and your monitor supports Dolby Vision, which to be fair is not very many monitors, then you're kind of out of luck because your PC is not really supporting that format. The only way is through smart TV apps or some sort of external, maybe it's a media player or something like that, which may not have those processing capabilities I was talking about on the GPU side. So yeah, we're kind of stuck in that position where, ideally I'd be sitting here saying, yeah, you run Netflix, it's got Dolby Vision support, you can run a PC app that does that, you can benefit from your GPU's features, and you push all of that out to your monitor, which basically just displays the content, and that's that. But with the way things are at the moment, yeah, smart TV, I guess, has some place for those sort of additional features and functions. So for high-end monitors, especially those that are targeting things like Dolby Vision, that want to enhance that sort of streaming content, then the smart TV side of things could be important, could be a selling point. We could be seeing that becoming more and more important. But ideally, the way I've sort of been describing things running on the GPU, running on your PC is the way it ideally should be done. So yeah, we'll keep tracking that. We'll keep seeing how that goes as things evolve and where those sorts of, will we get Dolby Vision support for PC gaming and for PC apps? We'll see. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on that one. Can you give us a sense of when we are bottlenecking our system with a bad monitor? For example, is it stupid to use a 60Hz monitor with a mid-range system, or to buy a 4090 before buying an OLED? What percentage of our budget should go towards the monitor? So it's not really stupid to use a 60Hz monitor if that's all you can afford, if you're using a low-end sort of system and you've only got the money for a 60Hz monitor. Fair enough, that's kind of where entry-level monitors are in that sort of very budget category. So yeah, you can't really call that stupid, it's just the way it is. But yeah, if you're using a mid-range system, especially if you've upgraded to a more modern mid-range GPU or even entry-level mainstream GPU, sort of you're spending $500 on your GPU and you're still using a 60Hz monitor, probably not something that I would advise. I think you'd be much better off spending that sort of $500 budget or a portion of that on a high refresh rate monitor. You can buy a 1440p, 144, 165 Hz type of, pretty good quality monitor these days for about $250 to $300 US. So if you are spending $500 on your GPU upgrade, maybe spend $300 of that on a nice new high refresh rate monitor. See how that impacts your experience and then go for the GPU upgrade afterwards. I think for anyone gaming at 60 Hz right now, that is the upgrade path that I would go with. Get your high refresh rate monitor first, enjoy that experience, get something that's going to last you for a reasonable period of time, so preferably 1440p and up, then go for the GPU upgrade as the second thing that you'll be considering maybe down the track. Maybe it'll be a future upgrade. I think you'll be enjoying your experience much more from the higher refresh rate than from the faster GPU. But again, it depends on your scenario. You may be trying to play games and your GPU simply can't run the games at higher than say 30 FPS, in which case, of course, then a GPU upgrade may make more sense. I think though, for sort of like the 4090 versus OLED discussion, I would definitely buy the OLED before the 4090 because things like HDR, for example, come at no performance cost. So if you've already got, say, a fairly capable higher end GPU, if you're buying a 4090, I'm expecting you have a pretty high end GPU, then you can pretty much just go straight from the gaming experience you have today in SDR to the gaming experience in HDR at, again, pretty much no cost to performance. You'll also benefit from the better motion clarity of an OLED at the same refresh rate. So you'll be getting those benefits from the better quality monitor just in general. And then the 4090 can, in the future, once you can, maybe afford a GPU upgrade in the future, again, buying a 4090 and an OLED is very expensive, but yeah, the OLED can sort of benefit a wide variety of scenarios. It's going to last you, hopefully, a long period of time and really enhance the gaming experience more than I would say that you would get from just the higher frame rates that would be possible from a 4090 or the higher visual quality in games. I think, for example, going from non-ray traced games that are using HDR, for example, is more impactful than running ray tracing in an SDR presentation. But that's just my opinion. That's a very subjective thing. You could prefer the SDR visuals with ray tracing, or you could prefer different types of performance. You may be heavily skewed towards FPS performance, in which case then maybe the OLED isn't the way to go. So yeah, it's a complicated question. I think what percentage of the budget should go towards the monitor. Certainly if I was spending $1,000 on a system in total, that doesn't get you heaps these days, unfortunately, but I would be at least wanting to ensure that I have a high refresh rate monitor in that, which would again be spending $200, $250, maybe even $300. So yeah, that's kind of the way that I would be seeing it at the moment. Don't neglect the monitor. I think a lot of people do neglect the display. It's a very important part of the gaming experience. It is what you see and will be interacting with the most on a daily basis. So don't neglect the monitor. Make sure that you've got a good quality monitor, or you don't even have to go high end, but make sure you've got a reasonable quality monitor before you start thinking about super expensive GPU upgrades. I think you'll appreciate that a lot more. Will OLED panels ever be usable for more than just a frivolous purchase, so they can be used comfortably for desktop productivity use given the high price? I think at some point in the future, yes, this will be the case. I think at the moment, it's hard to say whether a lot of these products will burn in for productivity use, but we're getting more and more information over time to the point where maybe in the future we will have a lot of good quality data that will tell us, hey, if you use your desktop monitor in this way for this length of time, then you're likely to see burn-in, but if you use it in a different way, then you'll see less burn-in. So during this sort of initial wave of OLED panels, I guess a lot of people are being very conservative, and rightly so, around burn-in, sort of, not recommending it to use in ways that we know can cause burn-in, so that you're not immediately buying an OLED monitor, burning it in after 6 months, and then being really sad and complaining because you've just destroyed the image quality of your brand new monitor. So that's kind of the way that I've been approaching it. Recommend against using those use cases. Use it for gaming, content consumption, those sorts of things, so that you're not immediately destroying your high quality brand new monitor. But I think in the future, as we see more and more pixel refreshing and compensation methods, the advancements in those sorts of things, the advancements in the OLED panels themselves, so that the actual OLEDs last for longer, those are all going to improve desktop productivity use, as well as there may be some software side features as well that can enhance the sort of longevity of OLED panels, because they're not going away. Like, OLED is the sort of the future of display technology, and OLED-like technologies will be the future. So I think over time, yes, there will be a point where desktop productivity use will be justifiable, but for right now, I'm not comfortable enough to recommend them for that use case. I don't think there's quite enough evidence of how desktop productivity use meshes with OLED to go that way just yet. But yeah, in the future, we'll probably see that being the case. Next question, why don't monitors have more USB ports on the back and sides? I'm sure many gamers and especially streamers could easily use 8 or more. Keyboard and mouse, webcam, game controller, mobile phone connection, microphone, speakers, headset, all those sorts of things can use USB ports. So I agree with this. I think that a monitor could very much be used as a USB hub type of system, especially if you've got your gaming PC on the floor as opposed to on your desk. It can be a little hard to access the USB ports in there, whereas your monitor is right on the desk. It's usually within arm's reach or close to arm's reach. So it makes a lot of sense to have additional USB ports on the thing that's on your desk right in front of you being used. And even if your desktop PC is on your desk, it could be further away, hard to reach the ports at the top or on the back. So it'd make a lot of sense to have more USB ports on the monitors. But unfortunately, a lot of monitors, they hide their USB ports away in sort of that awkward around the bottom underneath. You sort of got to fiddle around, try to figure out where they are. And they're typically more designed just for you plug something in once and kind of leave it there like a keyboard and mouse setup. And even then, you may only be getting 2 USB ports, if that. So yeah, it would make more sense to have monitors where there are easily accessible USB ports on the sides and along that bottom edge there, just for things like, hey, chuck a USB stick in, just plug that straight in, or a headset, you can easily plug that into the bottom or the sides of the monitor. And then maybe there'll still be some ports on the back if you want a bit nicer cable management. I think that would be a really good thing for monitors to include, especially as we see more USB-C inputs, which are smaller, easier to integrate nicely into a monitor. I think, yeah, it would make a lot of sense for these monitors to act more like a USB hub in terms of their USB outputs and give you heaps of connectivity that you can just hook everything up there. So to me, that would make a lot more sense. So monitor manufacturers, if you're listening, that's maybe an idea for you. Got an interesting question here from our Discord community. When getting a monitor delivered, do you wait for the monitor to reach room temperature before plugging it in and turning it on to avoid potential damage? So this is something I really haven't considered, maybe because I live in Australia where the outside temperature and inside temperature is typically pretty close. So if the monitor is getting delivered and it's been in a van that's, more outside ambient temperatures, you bring it inside, not much of a temperature difference. So the monitor inside the box is probably going to be pretty similar to the room temperature anyway, in which case then no, there's not going to be any potential damage there. But I guess if you live in a really cold climate where potentially your deliveries are sitting in vans that are much closer to 0 degrees Celsius or maybe even below that, I don't know, I don't live in places like Canada where I have to really consider those sorts of things, then yeah, you probably would want to wait for it to not be super icy cold, but I wouldn't expect it to damage the product if you turned it on and you started using it, even if it had just come straight from being outside in sort of negative, degrees Celsius type of temperatures. Wouldn't expect that to be too much of an issue. I imagine it would warm up quite quickly, especially as if you bring it inside and you start setting it up, it's probably already starting to warm up to those sorts of reasonable usage conditions. So yeah, I don't think that would be too much of a concern. What I have mentioned in the past though is that monitors are quite sensitive to temperatures in terms of their performance. So the colder your ambient environment is, typically the worse the monitor will perform. The warmer it is, the faster it will perform, which can lead to overshoot. So again, the worse it may perform in those scenarios. So typically it is better to, if you want the optimal viewing experience, that the monitor is warmed up before you start using it in that sort of way. For things like color calibration, for example, you definitely will want to warm it up to make sure that it's all running in the steady state optimal experience for you. And in addition to that, I have seen people talk about things like backlight bleed, uniformity issues and things like that after using their monitor for a very short period of time. So they'll bring the monitor in, set it up, they'll turn it on, they'll be like, oh, the backlight bleed on this monitor or IPS glow is not particularly great. But really with those features, those aspects to a monitor, not that they're a feature, you actually don't want IPS glow, but anyway, with those aspects to monitor performance, they can settle over time and improve a little bit over even a time period of 1 to 2 weeks. That's because in the manufacturing process and the packaging process, the monitor can be compressed down slightly. So the packaging can apply even a small amount of pressure, just pushes the panel a little bit closer together, which can exacerbate things like backlight bleed. And over time, as the monitor is adjusting to your ambient conditions, the room temperature, and it may expand very slightly to alleviate things like backlight bleed and IPS glow. Now, I'm not saying that this is a catch-all solution that you should just wait 2 weeks and your backlight bleed issues will be fixed. And I am talking about very minor differences in the panel composition and things like that. It's not like you'll visibly see a difference in the panel expanding over time. We're talking about very, very small differences. But if you want to assess things like backlight bleed properly and have a look at that over a period of time, then I'd be waiting about 2 weeks to sort of see how it settles over that period of time. And maybe you will see some improvement over that period, in which case then, yeah, maybe you won't be incentivized to switch out your monitor for something else. So yeah, those are the sorts of things that I think about when setting up a monitor, thinking about room temperature, ambient environment, how long you should be waiting. Yeah, there is some benefit to doing that, but I think as far as avoiding damage, making sure that it's at the right temperature, I don't think that's a huge factor. If a monitor panel is 8-bit plus FRC, should we enable 10-bit color in the NVIDIA or AMD software? Does it have any impact on performance like response time? So no, don't expect the difference between 8-bit and 10-bit to have any difference on performance. I've never really seen that or assessed that. Input latency as well should be very similar between those two operating conditions. I guess I shouldn't say that that is the case for all monitors, because there could be monitors out there where there is a difference between those two conditions, but typically speaking, doesn't make too much of a difference on the performance side of things. As to whether you should enable 10-bit versus just using 8-bit on your 8-bit plus FRC monitor, I've had a look at this at times in the past, and I haven't really seen too much of a difference between 8-bit and 10-bit on an 8-bit monitor, even with FRC. Very, very minor, typically speaking. It's not something that I would really be hanging up too much over, whether it's running an 8-bit or 10-bit mode on an 8-bit panel. It's kind of like, yeah, the differences just aren't that significant. Typically though, I would just enable 10-bit anyway, because then you're giving the full signal to the monitor that it can then process it with. So potentially the 10-bit signal is going to give a little bit more information to be used for the FRC algorithm and things like that. But again, doesn't make a huge difference. So for example, if your monitor has some bandwidth limitations in the ports and you can't run it at 10-bit and the maximum refresh rate, that's not the biggest deal breaker. Ideally, you'd want to run it at 10-bit, but not the biggest deal breaker if you have to turn it down to 8-bit if the panel is still just a native 8-bit panel. So yeah, my personal recommendation would be, if you can, turn up to 10-bit. There's really no downsides to doing that. But if you have to sell with 8-bit or you want to run it at 8-bit, it's not going to be that much of a difference visually. Final question. This is an interesting question. Why is it that the marketing cycle for gaming monitors seems so weak compared to so many other components, peripherals, and even driver features prevalent in the gaming/enthusiast market? A 27-inch 1440p 165Hz display would almost certainly be a greater upgrade to far more gamers than a 4060 with ray tracing and DLSS 3.0. So why does consumer awareness of good, beyond basic 60Hz IPS LCD gaming monitors, lag behind? This is a great question, a really great question. And I think part of that comes down to, I guess me wondering why a company like MSI, Gigabyte, and Asus, for example, don't push the monitor side of things a bit more heavily than the GPU side of things, because I imagine monitors are a higher margin type of product category than GPUs, which are known to be a very slim margin category. So potentially they could make greater margins and make more money selling displays compared to selling graphics cards. So there really should be that incentive just from those company perspectives to advertise these monitors as being a really key upgrade path for users and those sorts of things. It's probably a little bit different for brands that are more focused on either exclusively producing monitors, so a BenQ would come to mind, or do a wide variety of products that aren't, they could make margins on other things like Samsung, LG make a extremely wide variety of products. Monitors are only one part of that, so they're all obviously always considering where the marketing budget is going to be allocated, and potentially, monitors are not a huge product category, so maybe they don't get a huge marketing budget. So yeah, I think marketing for monitors could certainly be a lot better, a lot stronger, could be incentivizing people to upgrade in various different ways, but it's often, it's hard to describe certain benefits to monitors, which can be subjective. With things like graphics cards, for example, the 4060 with ray tracing as an example, it can be easier to say, hey, well, your frame rate number is bigger, so that's a really easy way to advertise the performance benefit that you're getting from that product. Your old GPU does 60 FPS, your new GPU does 90 FPS, 90 is higher than 60, easy to market, that sort of thing. And again, with things like quality settings, like ray tracing, again, it does, I guess, become a little bit subjective there, but the brand awareness over ray tracing, I guess, helps out a bit when you've got not just the GPU manufacturers like Asus, Gigabyte, MSI, those brands, but you've also got massive companies like Nvidia sort of pushing those features and giving that brand awareness, because ultimately Nvidia makes a lot of money from selling their GPUs. So with monitors, I think part of the issue comes down to, how do you really show someone what HDR does to an image when you can't just show HDR images on an SDR screen? Like, how do you know what that looks like? And even describing things like, okay, well, the contrast is enhanced. It's brighter in bright areas and darker in dark areas. It's not as simple as, sort of saying the overall, you can say the overall quality is better, but like, what does that mean? Like, if you're not really familiar with what high dynamic range means, you're not familiar with what contrast means, or really the intricacies of what HDR provides, then it can be hard to describe that to people. It's more of a, like, you have to experience it to notice the different sort of thing. Again, things like high refresh rates. Like, if you've never used a high refresh rate panel before, you can say things like, oh, well, it's smoother, it appears a bit clearer, it's a better experience, but what does that really mean apart from high number is better type things? And I think, yeah, some of those aspects to things can struggle in terms of selling these things to gamers. How difficult is it for even me to describe what things like color space, color accuracy, delta E's, response times, what do those things actually mean? How do they impact the actual experience for you as a viewer? That's a question that I'm always thinking about. It is difficult even from just a reviewing perspective, whereas I feel like, again, graphics card features, other PC component features, it's a bit easier to describe those sorts of differences and market it on those sorts of things. Again, things like keyboards. You can talk about the responsiveness of the keys, the clicky tactile feel. What does that difference mean? I think a lot of people would understand that a bit easier than something like delta E's or response times in milliseconds and overshoot and those sorts of things. So yeah, I'd like to see better display marketing. I'd really like to see a bigger push to get all gamers running high refresh rate displays. 1440p 144 Hz, as I keep saying, is a very good bang for buck category, and I'd like to see a lot more push towards getting people to upgrade from 60 to 144 Hz and really finding ways to tell everyday casual gamers how much better the experience is using those high refresh rate panels. I think that would be really great for the market. And then again, a secondary push towards how do we get people to understand that high-end HDR experiences are worth paying for? Maybe they've shot themselves a little bit in the foot there with advertising these really crappy low-end displays as having HDR performance, because then people will experience HDR and be like, that's really not good. That's really not what I was expecting. Maybe I'm not going to be incentivized to upgrade to that high-end HDR experience that really gives what HDR is offering. So I think there's a lot of lessons that could be learnt there from companies to improve the marketing, to get people to push to one of those two categories. I think there's a lot of avenues there. But yeah, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Monitors are great. I love monitors. I think it's the one of the most important aspects to your PC setup as you interact with it so often. So yeah, market monitors more, guys. Give us some great options. Thanks. All right, and that does it for this month's Monitors Unboxed Q&A session. We'll be back in another couple of months to answer a lot more of your questions, especially, if we do get those 4K OLED monitors in the early parts of next year. I'm sure we'll be getting a lot of questions about that. So yeah, stay tuned for more Q&A sessions. And if you do appreciate these videos, then please do consider subscribing to the channel. And also, if you want to support us directly, we've got our Patreon and Float Plan accounts. Links to those are in the description below. Thanks to everyone that submitted a question for this Q&A. I know we get a lot of questions. We can't answer all of them in these ones, but I do make a note of some additional questions for future videos. So if you've asked a question here and it wasn't answered, there's always a chance that it may be brought back for a future video. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.